Hi, my name is Archie and this is Phoebe. Thanks for tuning into my presentation. So to briefly summarize what I'm going to be talking about today, so basically this is a presentation about mental health, mental illness, about identities of madness, and how those topics interrelate with animal advocacy, animal defense, animal rights. So first, to start off, I'm going to offer up a land acknowledgement. So I am a white settler residing on stolen indigenous territory, and I continue to benefit from a lot of the privileges that come from the result of historic and ongoing colonization of Turtle Island here. Specifically, I am on Saanich, Lekwungen, and Esquimalt, Coast Salish and Strait Salish nations. So if you can, I would really encourage you just to pause the video right now and make sure that you are at least familiar with the people's territory that you are residing on, potentially occupying, depending where you're watching this from. And so those kind of conversations are important. I think they're necessary for another video altogether, but I think that's important to acknowledge. And to go further, I'm going to just also be honest in saying that a lot of the material, the content I'm going to be talking about in this video, a lot of it comes from lived experiences and from the mental, emotional labor of other people's. And so I'm not, when I'm presenting this material, I'm not looking for credit or validation as something that I have produced. I'm really just trying to make this space, this conference here, using my privilege to access it, to bring up these kinds of conversations that are really important when we're talking about disability, about animal politics. And then as well, I want to offer, bring up a content warning for what I'm going to be talking about. It's a lot of potentially triggering material, and it's going to be conversations about ableism, about specifically mental illness, about disability. There's going to be conversations about speciesism, about animal abuse, animal testing, and there's going to be conversations about misogyny, so a lot of patriarchy, a lot of gaslighting, and medicalization of women and women's bodies. And finally, just for the introduction, I want to just do about 3 breaths to kind of ground ourselves as we go through this presentation. I think it's really important, depending if this is the first video you're watching on its own, or if you're going to be watching this video as part of the wider conference that this is happening with. I think it's really important that you're really present with what I'm going to be talking about, so that way your mind is here and you're not still processing a lot of the other information that you may have picked up throughout the day, depending where you're coming from. So if we can just do one quick breath, I would appreciate that. So just a slow breath in and a slow breath out. Okay, so thank you. So to start, so when I say embracing her story of animal-loving madness, so what am I talking about? And to explain that, I think it'll be best if I go backwards through the title itself. So, animal-loving madness. So, animal-loving madness was once considered a legitimate mental disorder among the medical industry. So they characterized it as dangerous, obsessive insanity among people who were over-concerned, over-empathetic with the suffering of animals. And so the term zoophil psychosis was the clinical term developed, and it literally means psychotic love of animals. And so it was first coined, excuse me, first coined by Charles Dana in 1909. And so Dana was, he was a very influential neurologist in the United States. He was at Cornell. He was a leading animal vivisectionist, so he did a lot of animal testing. He was very invested in the industry of animal testing. And so he pronounced this medical disorder of zoophil psychosis, calling it a dangerous psychological malady that was manifesting in people who were advocating for animals. And so he first published this again in 1909 in the Medical Record, which is a scientific journal. And so he, described the characteristics through case studies, saying that it's an enduring sensitivity, and excessive overconcern with animals. And so some of the cases he talked about were people who were very bothered by horses being mistreated in the streets. And so this is 1909 when there's horse carriages were very common. So people who were getting upset by the beatings of horses, he characterized this as suffering from zoophil psychosis. As well, people trying to intake a lot of stray cats in eating homes, cat fostering. He found this again to be a sort of a bizarre obsession that was psychologically dangerous, and so he was treating this medically. And so, what Dana was getting at here, just because he was so invested in animal testing, from his position, his status, he was describing that people who were getting sick with this animal empathy, that it was a danger to civilized society, a danger to scientific progress, that it was just a danger to people manifesting psychopathic characteristics, which were initially being understood as animal advocacy, as animal rights, whereas he was trying to instead say that it's not a political issue, it's actually a group of people with mental illness who need to be treated. And so it's really convenient that his diagnosis created a massive stigma around his opponents who were trying to undermine his scientific research, his economic investments, and what he was doing. And so at the time, in the early 1900s in the United States, anti-vivisection was gaining a lot of traction. It was gaining a lot of popularity and political clout in society. A lot of the campaigns were being led by women who were also involved in a lot of suffragette movements and a lot of child protection, advocacy for the poor and homeless. And so with this clinical diagnosis developed, Dana and the other medical industry, along with the media, were able to really redirect what the conversations were about. And so instead of about testing on animals, the legitimacy and the morality of that, it was conversations about the mental well-being of people challenging these doctors, these men in offices. And a lot of mainstream media picked up on this. New York Times especially was very supportive of this diagnosis. And there was a lot of articles, some of them included titles, "Passion for Animals, Really a Disease," with a lot of really ridiculous quotes saying that anti-vivisectionists cared little for human suffering, that there was a preposterous love of pet animals that pushed people to the verge of insanity. Another editorial in New York Times in 1910 saying that anti-vivisectionists, they are queer people involving an actual hatred of human beings. And so again, this is the kind of content that is being put out by the media in defense of Charles Dana, in this zoophil psychosis diagnosis. So with her story of animal madness, this is applying a feminist perspective towards understanding what this diagnosis of zoophil psychosis was really all about. And so when you dive deeper, you can understand that Dana and the wider medical establishment, as well as the media, were also gendering this diagnosis of mental illness. They were characterizing it to be particularly common among women, women who were out in the streets politically aggressive and opposing dominant institutions like the medical industry. And so they were describing zoophil psychosis as leading to symptoms where people would abandon their domestic responsibilities. And so essentially, reading through those lines, what the doctors were saying is that these women were not being or not being responsible according to their standards of what a woman should be doing. And so they wanted to medicalize that as a dangerous psychosis. And so there was a lot of quotes even from, directly from Charles Dana's articles describing that zoophil psychosis could lead to secondary symptoms including asexuality, selfishness, jealousy, foolishness, and other related disinterest that would relate to caring more for felines than being a nurturing wife and a potential mother. And as well, the medical record, so again, this popular scientific journal describing in 1910 an article saying that the victims of this zoophil psychosis consisted of women who coddle their pets and love them more than babies. And so zoophil psychosis was really related to the diagnosis of hysteria as a psychological disorder among women. So hysterical neurosis was not removed from the DSM until 1980. So it was a very popular way to undermine the voices of women by describing their any anger, any resentment, any defiance towards patriarchal institutions as being a form of mental disturbance that needs to be treated instead of actually listened to. So really with this, you can understand that, you know, when there's a male-dominated institution in 1910 of the medical industry, of the media, again, there was more articles coming out with titles saying women who love animals hate people. So again, just really blatant examples that that by manufacturing this illness, they were able to also simultaneously uphold repressive gender roles by dismissing the women who were leading campaigns against the testing of animals. Okay, so talking about embracing the animal-loving madness. And so what I'm talking about here is trying to develop more comprehensive ways of having radical disability politics into animal advocacy, animal defense, specifically around mental illness. And so, you know, when I'm talking about zoophil psychosis earlier, I'm not meaning to suggest that somehow an origin of ableism in animal rights mainstream culture today, but more that it is an interesting illustrative example of an overlap between disability and animal advocacy back a century ago. But currently, mainstream animal rights culture is definitely lacking in considering disability within a radical, empowering way of, you know, building any significant ties with communities with disabilities. And so there's a lot of examples that you can draw from. Just briefly to go over, you have a lot of the major organizations, the major thinkers who take a lot of space and gather a lot of attention and status. You know, there's PETA with a lot of their campaigns talking about body shaming and offering a healthy solution towards fixing people's physical illnesses or preventing mental illnesses in the case of autism, one of their autism anti-dairy campaign posters. As well, there's popular writers like Peter Singer who talk about elevating animals with higher IQ over peoples with disabilities who have lower IQs. And then there is a lot of language around equating animal abuse with mental illness, and so that's one of the most popular things that I've found. There's Gary Francione, who talks frequently about moral schizophrenia, and there is just a lot of language thrown around where it's equating meeting with sick people with animal abuse as psychopaths, and a lot of slogans brought up, such as people being blind to justice or standing up for animals, quote unquote, and being the voice for the voiceless. Again, lots of air quotes, just talking about really ableist language to as an effort to validate what this animal rights politics is about. So I find a lot of this to be shortcuts to really articulating well what we're talking about when we're saying that there is speciesism in our societies that exploit animal bodies, but referring to ableist rhetoric that is built on the oppression of other bodies, other minds, peoples with disabilities. That this is it's doomed to failure. It's doomed to breaking ties instead of actually building solidarity within communities. I think what's a really important way for moving past these sorts of things about, developing a more empowering sense of madness, about mad pride within animal rights, within animal liberation. I think the ways of doing this are moving away from a lot of the emphasis on presenting animal politics as rational, as scientific, as objective. I understand the reasons for that as a way to cater towards mainstream society and a lot of the politically influential institutions and people, but I think in the process of doing this we are losing a really important element that our emotions, that our empathy are really powerful, radical tools. They're radical expressions of who we are as people, as animals, and I don't think those are things that we should be negotiating with or apologizing for. And there's a lot of really great quotes I can draw from books I've read about these sorts of things, where Patrice Jones talk in the book Aftershock, which is about activist trauma. So it's a really interesting read if you if you have the time and the money to devote towards that. But one of the few sentences that I drew upon for this presentation is where Patrice is describing how men of many cultures have sought to transcend their own bodies while reducing women and animals to their body parts. Seeing themselves as more rational and self-determined, men claim the right to rule over those they see as more emotional, impulsive, and bound to bodily rhythms. So end quote. So I think that's a really succinct way of describing what our society built on speciesism, on ableism, is really nurturing things of objectivity, of disconnection from our bodies, from our minds, and a lot of fear of disability, of illness. And I think those are things that are actually empowering for radical liberation, and so things we should not shy away from. So ways we can keep going with that, with empowering animal madness, of almost trying to reclaim kind of identities of zoophil psychosis. I think there needs to be a lot more emphasis on community care when we're doing animal advocacy, and this can look like a lot of different ways, but the basic idea here is that we're not treating self-care on its own sake, but especially for peoples with illnesses, chronic illnesses, and disabilities. Not treating that as somehow a side issue, as an afterthought that is not associated with organizing, with protests, with activism, because that is a very community-involved process where we can make space and give up space for people who need to be heard when their needs are such that they need more attention and more community support. I think when we do this, we can move away from perceiving dependency, interdependency, and vulnerability as negative things. I think those are, again, they're things we have been taught to be afraid of out of weakness, fear of being seen as weak, but I think they're actually very powerful, revolutionary things to really explore more. And so, when we're doing this, when we're talking about activism for animals, I think we can for ourselves to take a step back and really look at, what is activism, and who is defining what activism is. So instead of the very common depictions of activists as the people marching the streets, making a lot of noise and taking up a lot of space, while it's important, I think it's also important to acknowledge that people who are taking time off to care for themselves with an illness, I think that is activism in its own right. And people, single mothers who are raising children, but can't attend group meetings, can't attend potlucks because they're working, or because they have disabilities and live in a community that is architecturally designed to not accommodate them, prevents them from attending things, protests, and other social gatherings. I think we need to respect that those are forms of activism to exist in societies that are not built to support those kinds of people. Supporting those marginalized peoples, that is activism in its own right. So yeah, I think that's really important that we figure out ways to redefine what our boundaries are of activism, of community support, of self-care, of what liberation is as a whole, and understand that disability, mental illness, these aren't things that need to be perceived as something to be fixed, as though there's something wrong with a disability, as though it's not wholly natural as health as we know it. I think the idea here is that we need to be making space for communities and peoples with disabilities to be able to access these kinds of conversations right here, and these sorts of issues towards liberation. And so finally, I think one of another really important way that we can move towards making more accessible animal politics happen in our communities for people with physical disabilities and for mental illnesses here. I think depending on what the community actions are, whether it's the more confrontational protests of in the streets involving police, or if it's engaging with animals who are being exploited right in front of us, in such cases as slaughterhouses or zoos, marine parks, things like that. I think it's really ideal if we can try to develop more of an infrastructure for support of people who are coming out to these things, to have some way to debrief, ideally with people who are trained with post-traumatic stress disorder, to help transition people to not take a lot of this grief, a lot of this really violent speciesism and other things we can experience at protests, to not take all that home with us alone. Again, what I was saying earlier about making self-care and self-love for people with illnesses and disabilities, making that a community affair. I think the emphasis on protesting, I think, should really be half of the event as a whole, whereas I think the other half should be meant towards really feeding the community afterwards, so that we can leave that space and feel that we have support and that we are being taken care of by ourselves and by each other. I think that's that those sorts of steps are going to make a more sustainable, a more radical space available for long-term success in liberation, and more examples of momentary liberation for people to feel good and feel like we are doing things that are really feeding our souls, our spirits for resisting oppression. And yeah, that is about everything I wanted to talk about. I'll respond to questions if you want to comment on the YouTube video itself. But again, I think it's important for us just to kind of remember that, taking Zoophil's psychosis as a case study example, to illustrate overlap between disability and animal politics, that there are a lot of ableism logic that has been internalized and kept along through the years in animal rights culture, and I think that there's absolutely so much potential for us to drop all of those habits and those sort of relationships of supporting other oppressive dynamics. We can drop that from a lot of our community organizing, and that we can move towards a lot more empowering ways of negotiating space, of connecting with different communities, and of challenging the status quo. And I think doing that by embracing more of our emotions, by embracing more of our empathy, and not being so afraid of madness, of taking pride in in our mad identities and our mental illnesses. I think there is really great potential that we can really shift our perspectives and how we understand what health is, and what disability is, and what liberation is going to look like today, tomorrow, and for the future. Yeah, and so that's everything. Thanks for listening. Okay, bye.